All right. So I was very, very overwhelmed by the extent of your career and reviewing all of the various things that you've done, the papers you've written, the books that you've written as well. And so how I shaped the interview was a bit different than I usually do. I took some of the statements that you have made in the past and I tried to kick off some questions from there because I was watching some of the videos at my desk and going, "Oh my God, I need to know more about this." So, that's how I shaped the interview. And so we'll talk a little bit about smell and taste and olfaction, and also how that impacts health and well-being. And then we'll finish off talking about olfaction and cognitive function. So I will start with something that has definitely become a cliche in the smell industry. At least what I've heard from others is that there's this real connection between olfaction and emotion and memory. And listening to your talks and to some of the research that you've done, I have a whole new perspective of this statement now. So I understand that this is where you dedicated much of your early research. And you said something in your TED Talk that really got me, which is we might not experience emotion if we didn't have a sense of smell. So this was a very big statement for me. And so I wanted to know, can you expand on this and then perhaps talk about how the neuroanatomy or the structure of the brain supports this idea?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And just as a little background, it was in fact this exact question. So what is the relationship between smell and emotional memory that I actually did my PhD on? And the light bulb went off when I was reading a paper in graduate school where the authors used smell to manipulate mood, and it had never been done before. And there was like one paragraph describing how this was a sense which really impacted this sort of basic neurocircuitry involved in emotion, and that it was sort of precognitive in the sense that it wasn't relying on you thinking about something and then getting to the emotion. Rather, it reached emotion first. And this is actually sort of critical in terms of the neuroanatomy of our sense of smell. So the way that sort of neuroevolutionarily speaking, so going back to that statement of we wouldn't have emotion if we didn't have the sense of smell, is that in terms of the evolution of our brain and evolution of all other brains, the area that is currently subdivided into various different structures, including the amygdala, which is where emotion and emotional memory is processed, as well as olfaction, and the hippocampus, which is involved in various forms of associative learning and memory. These are all structures within an area called the limbic system. Now, very early on in neuroevolution, this whole part of the brain was just dedicated to sensing chemicals. So, knowing that either the smell or the taste of something is good or bad. And then through evolution, it became subdivided into these various different regions. So and actually single-celled organisms, the most primitive organisms on the planet and the first organisms on the planet, their number one way of navigating their existence and navigating in the world they were in was through chemical senses. So there's another chemical in the pond, I should go towards it to eat it, I should get away from it because it's going to eat me, and so forth. So that is the basis for life as we know it on this planet. And in fact, as a function of the fact that from the point of view of our brain, this chemical sensing part of it was the primary part of it, and then subdivided into these other areas, and most specifically the amygdala, which is where emotion is processed, were derived from being able to sense chemicals. So if it weren't for being able to sense chemicals, potentially these other structures wouldn't have evolved, and most particularly the amygdala, which is where we experience emotions. So hence, if it weren't for our sense of smell, we may not experience emotion. And it's also the case, and this is just from a neuroevolutionary perspective, neuroanatomical perspective, but if you think about what the meaning of chemicals are and what the meaning and function of emotions are, you can see that it's actually completely parallel. So I gave you this very sort of simplistic example of, go towards the good chemical, get away from the bad one. But, that's fundamentally survival. So we need, food to exist. We need mates to reproduce, et cetera. We need to get away from things that are going to consume us, et cetera. However, when you think about what the emotions are doing, it's actually the exact same thing, but at a more complex level. So positive emotions are there to keep us alive. Negative emotions are also there to keep us alive and get us away from or to combat, things that are dangerous to us. So the emotional system basically provides the same kind of survival-based information, just at a more abstracted level, as a sort of a primitive example of the chemical senses. And from the point of view of how we respond to smells today, it is actually fundamentally the same way. So we are attracted to a scent. I like that. I want to go towards it. Or we are repelled by a scent. I want to get away from it, which is, again, the sort of fundamental basis for our emotional processing and how we experience emotion. But the interesting thing is that with respect to our responses to smell, they're learned and not innate, almost exclusively. There are a couple of potential examples to that, which I can explain a little later on. But unlike, for example, an innate response to fear, for example, so I dangle a baby off of a cliff edge, for instance, and there'll be an immediate desire to sort of get away from that because fear is an innately sort of established response. But with smell, our responses of I like it or I don't like it are not based on innate responses. They're based on learned responses. And the reason for that is actually because of the kind of animal that humans are. And by that, I mean that we are what is referred to as generalists. So we can exploit and exist in any habitat on this planet. And so what is a good chemical and what is a bad chemical varies tremendously across the different environments that humans can find themselves in. And the most important thing is that we learn based on our first experiences with the environment what is good and what is bad, rather than having it hardwired into us, because there's too many possibilities, and potentially the exact same smell, as it were, could be good in one context but bad in another. So we have to learn based on the situation, based on our experience, based on where we happen to be, what is good and what is bad. But from a neuroanatomical perspective, so the primary processing of the sense of smell, that is where the conscious perception of smell takes place. So where we go, that's a lemon or that's banana, that takes place in the amygdala hippocampal complex. So the conjoined structures of the amygdala, which is where emotion and emotional memory is processed, and the hippocampus, where associative learning takes place in various forms of memory. So the association of learning, for example, bananas are good, I like that smell, and that's a positive experience, is taking place fundamentally at the exact same moment as perceiving that scent. Now, if you've never smelled bananas before, you would have more of a potentially sort of skeptical, maybe cautious response because you don't know what it is. But immediately upon first tasting and smelling the banana, knowing that it was nutritious, feeling that it feels good to consume, you would form a positive link to it.
Very nice description of olfaction. And